was actually reading today, by the way, that I don't know if you deal much with national issues about things that, could affect farmers, but in Wales, I know that they've introduced the NVZs, what are they called now? Nitrate vulnerable zones. And I don't know if do you do much with this sort of larger scale things where one of the news articles it said it could put out, I've forgotten the number now, but there was a large amount of farmers out of business just from simply, a lot of them now being on the edge anyway in Wales as well because of Brexit and COVID and everything coming at once. And now they've got to adhere to these, fairly valid controls based on not polluting the waterways, depending on which science you believe. But do you have to deal with that sort of thing as well, where you can actually not only support those farmers who may go out of business, but do you go and try and talk to those making the policy saying, look, this is going to have a massive effect on the farming community in Wales here, this one policy or not?
So again, we aren't a lobbying group in the sense of kind of presenting evidence and the like to the government. We're obviously very supportive of the farming community, and we do work with a lot of organizations. We're very, very closely aligned with, for example, the National Farmers Union, and we work very closely with all sorts of charities and organizations. When you said in relation to the national issues there, things like when there's flooding, as we're experiencing at the moment, and there's lots of farmers affected by that. In normal times, we have farmers on the ground providing support in many instances, working closely again with other charities like Forage Aid, for example, which specifically is there to help farmers who have been affected in relation to forage and access to forage and that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, we do get involved in supporting people through national challenges, and that, I suppose, is in the DNA of the organization, because when we were founded as the Farm Crisis Network, it was off the back of crises sort of a couple of decades ago that were really affecting farmers, things like mad cow disease and foot and mouth.
Sure, yeah, I know. And there's also as well things that people don't really realize, because I just flick through the news every day, and at the minute apparently there's a lot of sheep being killed by dogs. I didn't know if that was what happened, but I mean, apparently the damage of something like 1.3 million pounds to those farmers who are already, pretty stuffed on prices a lot of the time, given there's a few issues to do with Brexit and so on. And yeah, I can't imagine these sorts of things. That's a large amount of money to be losing from any industry.
Yeah, that really frustrates me, because as you heard, I'm a dog owner myself, and I do take my dogs on walks. But if you're going through a field where there is livestock, and it's a field that you're publicly allowed to go through, the farmer's been sort of, is maintaining it, and it is a route that you can take. You need to be respectful and conscious that your dog could affect. I was actually walking one of my dogs the other day, probably about 2 weeks ago, and it was in my local area, and their dog was off leash. And when we walked through onto a field, the dog rushed off almost immediately and chased this herd of sheep about 3 fields across. And considering the time of year it is as well, those sheep probably pregnant, the ewes probably pregnant. So you just think to yourself, like, there are I don't think people really understand, people who don't work in farming or know much about farming don't necessarily understand the ramifications of just something like that. It's obviously terrible that a dog would chase them. Now, the dog didn't attack them or anything, and they probably just thought it was no harm done. But in terms of the long-term damage of that, it could be something significant. So it is very concerning when these things happen. And that'll be, the same, not just keeping dogs on leads, but also people, when they're walking onto fields, making sure they close the gate behind them.
Yeah, sure.
There are sort of many examples of where people have left gates open and livestock have got out and been hurt or killed or lost. And so, yeah, that's another thing people just sort of need to be conscious of, that when they're out enjoying their leisure time, they're actually walking into someone's business. This is a farmer's livelihood, and so they just need to be conscious that it's not all just fun and games. They are actually, this is people's life, and they need to be very respectful of it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, even on the flip side of that, around here locally, I won't mention too much more else on that, otherwise we get into trouble. But there's at least rumor that one of the dogs who was chasing pregnant ewes around here got shot. and died, and it was just around, it wasn't that far away, a couple of miles up the road. And so, you know, even on that side of things, it's, I don't know what the ramifications for that are. Is that, if they're doing that, I think it's allowed anyway, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty.
I can't be. I'm not sure what the legality of it is, but I definitely feel for the farmers, and I think perhaps more does need to be done to just sort of remind people to, you know, keep your dog on a leash if it's going to go running off. But
Yeah, tragic.
interestingly enough, I then on the same day after that happened, I passed a woman who was walking 3 border collies off leash, and they were the most, I couldn't believe it. I've never seen anything like it. They were the most well-behaved dogs I've ever seen. So they were walking around her, and the sheep were about 3 meters away from us, and her border collies were not interested in the sheep at all. They were just stood right next to her. And I was like, I mean, if you're someone whose dogs are that well trained, and you know that, then you know to the best of your ability that they're not going to go off running after sheep, you know. But I think most people probably wouldn't attest to that. I have a border collie myself. I would not let my border collie off anywhere near livestock. Do not.
But they're called sheepdogs, so I mean, it would be doing what comes naturally to them.